Well, we are very honored to welcome our next guest to the show, an astronaut, Navy captain, veteran of 4 space flights, commander of the International Space Station, a man who set a record in October 2015, one he says that was meant to be broken, of 340 days in space, and we are talking about astronaut Scott Kelly, and we are so pleased to welcome him to the show. We appreciate you joining us. Congratulations on your book. It is titled Endurance, A Year in Space, Lifetime of Discovery, and people can pick up one wherever books are sold. It is so good to see you, sir. Thanks for taking the time to come here.
Thank you. We
appreciate it. Jacksonville is just so elated to have you, and you said you spent some time here at Cecil Field back in the day.
Absolutely. I love Jacksonville. Love Florida.
Well, we're happy to have you. Okay, so I want to talk about some of the questions that you might get asked, I'm sure every single time you go out to an event. And the first one is, you spent a year in space, okay? So coming back after spending a year, what have you noticed mentally and physically, after spending a year without gravity?
Well, physically, there was definitely a difference between this flight that was 340 days versus my previous one, which was 159 days. So, there were things I had experienced that I didn't have on the shorter flight, like my legs were swelling up when I would stand up, rashes, anywhere my skin had touched anything, because it hadn't touched anything in such a long time.
And so one of the things that NASA wanted to learn, right? This is all about a manned mission to Mars. And so one of the things they wanted to learn was, what can a body tolerate to be in space for prolonged periods of time? And can we withstand things like radiation? And you knew going into it the risks, and you're like, yeah, that's one of the reasons why I wanted to go, right? Of sorts, to be able to be almost a human guinea pig.
Yeah, that's true. But, it's not only me that does this. Anyone who flies in space has those same, risks. It's just in this case, it was for a much longer period of time.
What was it like when you were up in the International Space Station and you were looking down, and you were very prolific in your documentation on Instagram and what have you, all what you were seeing below you? For people who will never have that experience, what was that like?
Well, Earth is incredibly beautiful. It's the Bahamas, which is near here, and it's unmistakable. But, not only do you get to appreciate the beauty of the planet, but you also can see the fragility of our atmosphere. It's very thin, kind of like a contact lens on an eye. Over your eye, there's, certain parts of the planet that's almost always covered in pollution. You see the deforestation in the rainforest. So
it's a little troubling seeing some of that.
On one hand, it's a privilege to see the Earth from space, very beautiful, but on the other hand, concerning at times.
You said going into it, you kind of viewed yourself as like a tough fighter pilot kind of guy, but then after spending a year in space, you were quoted as saying you're a little more compassionate now.
Much more sensitive.
Why do you think you said that? You were also quoted as saying that you've changed. How did it change you?
Well, when you look at the Earth from space and you don't see political borders, it makes you feel like all humanity is together on this one planet, flying through space, almost like the Earth is our own spaceship and we're all a member of the same crew. But when you hear the news from Earth, generally bad news. I'm sure being a news person.
And how did you get that news? Did they kind of relay it to you? Do you have an internet connection where you look at, do Apple iPhones work up there? How did you stay in touch with what was going on the ground?
Yeah, they can uplink live TV. So most of the time I had CNN playing. No offense.
None taken. No ESPN, no Sports Center, nothing like that.
Absolutely. I would watch all the football games live, and baseball, Astros tonight.
Yeah, I knew you wanted to get that.
Could I say that?
You can say whatever you want. I'm rooting for the Astros.
Well, I didn't know if you were going to play this tomorrow and then
No, it's okay. It's okay. All right, so let's talk about your brother, because part of this experiment, if you will, of you being in space for a year, was to see kind of what happened to your body and then compare it to your brother, who is your identical twin. First of all, are there some bragging rights involved with you being in space for a year over the brother?
He spent 50 days in space. And I spent 500, so 520.
Not that you want to compare so much.
Yeah, 50, 500.
Yeah, there you go. Were you too competitive growing up?
No,
not really.
No,
not really?
Just in a joking kind of way.
A little bit. You're twin brothers. What about your mom? Because as a new mom, here's what I want to know. How did you wind up to be where you guys are? I want to raise my daughter and potential son to be like you, American heroes. How do we do that?
Well, I think, there's a saying about, preparation meets opportunity, and I think that's important. But for me, I'm a very unlikely kid to have, grown up to become an astronaut and be able to do these things. So when I was in school, I wasn't a good student. You know, I couldn't pay attention. I didn't do well.
Really?
Yeah, and it wasn't until I got to college and I discovered the book, The Right Stuff, and it became like my plan for the future, and it got me motivated. So, you know, this book is not only about space, but it's also about this kid that at 18 years old was never, you know, when I got to be 18, my whole education was spent looking out the window, and I righted the ship
Boy,
somehow.
did you?
Yeah.
And so part of it was reading that book, by the way, one of my favorite movies of all time, The Right Stuff. So that changed you, and then did you, upon reading that, then you kind of changed your trajectory, if you will, to
Absolutely.
then
you know,
pursue this?
I recognized that I had something, I felt like I had something in common with these guys, like personality-wise, you know, taking risk. I mean, just kind of how they were living their lives, with the exception of one thing. I couldn't study and do my homework and pay attention. And I felt like, you know, if I could change that one thing, maybe I could become an astronaut someday.
And you did it.
And I did.
And what is that like when you go and speak to kids and you say, hey, listen, you know, look at what I've done. You know, I went out this way and, you know, it didn't start out the way that one would think it would for one to become an astronaut. And look where I am today.
Well, I hope kids don't look at my example and say, well, I'm not going to pay attention then and I'll just like recover at 18, because I think, for one thing, it's a much different time. Plus, one of the greatest regrets of my life is spending my first 13 years of school basically, you know, looking out the window and not learning anything. I mean, complete waste of time. So but I hope kids that struggle will take some comfort in the fact that you can change your direction.
Yeah, and the school is now named after you and your brother. And I can't imagine, do you look back when you were in the International Space Station and you were looking down on Earth, did you ever go back and reflect looking out the window of your school and just think, man, really come literally and figuratively a long way?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, when I was 18 and I discovered that book, I read it, The Right Stuff, came up with a plan to change my life, become a better student, get into the Navy, fly airplanes. 18 years later, it took me 18 years, and then I was flying in space for the first time.
Never give up, never quit.
Never.
That's awesome. Congratulations on the book, Endurance. Thanks for being here.
Thank you.
Appreciate your time.
Thank you.